Okay, I wanted to wrap up a couple of things, and this will just be fairly quick. This is going to be the hybrid system. We talked about the parliamentary system last week. We talked about the presidential system a little bit this week. I wanted to go ahead and deal with the hybrid system, and this is actually capital letter C under systems in the legislative chapter. Hybrid system. Now, when you think about it, basically what you've got in all of these systems is that you're going to have the voters, and the voters are actually going to be down here at the bottom. So, presidential system, no issue with that. Parliamentary system, no issue with that. The hybrid system is basically along those same lines. The French have a tendency of putting some extra little tricks into things, and the French are actually probably the country that is most associated with hybrid. They do have something that is very, very different right off of the top. When you think about it, in France, the voters vote directly for the president of the country. The voters vote directly for the president. There is no party buffer, there is no electoral college buffer, but you vote yes directly for the president, the leader, the ultimate leader of the country. The other trick with this is that they actually are going to have, in a number of hybrid systems, multiple elections. So if you have the first example and you've got candidate A, candidate B, and candidate C, and candidate A gets 47, candidate B gets 37, and candidate C ultimately gets 26% of the vote. You don't have a majority there. What they oftentimes will do is they'll take off that third candidate and have another election, which is effectively going to guarantee that somebody is going to get a majority of the vote over there. So the voters vote directly for the president, and they're going to guarantee, because of a couple of different elections, the fact that this president is going to get a majority. You also, as you might would imagine, are going to have your parliament over here. Pretty straightforward kind of a thing. And in fact, you're typically going to have your party that's going to go in between. So voters vote for the party, and then proportionately the party will pick the parliament. Now, if the first little screw on this was the direct election there, of course you've got your indirect election over here, the second twist on things in the hybrid system is that you also have a prime minister. You have a prime minister. So basically what you've got here is that once the voters pick the president is now going to nominate the prime minister subject to the approval of the parliament. So the president will nominate subject to the approval of the parliament. Now, when you think about it, in the United States, the president is the head of state and the president is the head of government. When you think about the parliamentary system, the prime minister is going to be the head of government, the monarch is the head of state. Well, in the French system, you've actually got two executives. You have a president and you have a prime minister. Now, here's the trick on this. If Party A wins the presidency, if Party A wins the parliament, this is pretty straightforward. It's a slam dunk. Party A is now going to become the prime minister as well. And in this kind of a system, the French president would be effectively the head of government, and the French president is effectively going to be the head of state. And this executive, in this circumstance, because when you think about it, the president nominates the prime minister oversees the parliament, and you've got the same party in charge of all three, this is probably the strongest executive of them all. No ifs, no ands, no buts. Having said this, though, sometimes things get a little squirrely. And the squirrely part would be if Party B actually gets control of the parliament. Because if Party B gets control, remember the president nominates, but the parliament is ultimately going to have approval. And when you think about it, this means that they're probably going to have a Party B prime minister. So now you've got an executive over here, the president, that is from one party. You've got an executive over here who is a prime minister who is from the other party. How does it change? What they did in France is effectively the president became what was known as the head of state. The prime minister would basically be what was known as the head of the government. And they began to divide things. There's a term out there, and this term is known as cohabitation. Cohabitation is the idea that men and women would live together basically out of wedlock. They're cohabitating when you think about it. Well, in France, cohabitation means that you've got a president of one party, you've got a prime minister of the other party, and once again, they're sharing the same residence, or you might say in this system, they're sharing the same government. This would actually make the French president, or a hybrid president, potentially the weakest of the executives. So this president, if they have control, their party controls president, prime minister, and parliament, can conceivably be the strongest. The president, if it is divided from a different party with the prime minister, can actually potentially be the weakest of the executives that we've spoken about. So keep this in mind. What you see up here, and just to fill this in or flesh this out a little bit more, and let's go back to this original example. If the same party wins the parliament, if the same party wins the president and ultimately the prime minister, the president has the ability to appoint the prime minister subject to the approval by the parliament. We've talked about this. The president will also accept a letter of resignation, typically from the prime minister, as soon as that prime minister takes office. Why? Well, the thought of it is that they do not want to have messy firings. The president can remove the prime minister for basically any reason whatsoever just by turning over that letter of resignation that the prime minister will provide upon appointment. So when you think about this, the president can fire this prime minister not subject to parliamentary approval. Now, again, if it's all the same party, it makes pretty good sense. The prime minister is supposed to do what the president says. If they're different parties, yes, the president can still ultimately fire that prime minister. But what you end up seeing is that the president is going to have a difficult time getting a newer prime minister in to oversee this parliament because they're going to have the final say over whether that prime minister takes over or not. Couple of things. Appointments. Prime minister. There is also going to be some other appointments. You're going to have your courts. The president is going to be responsible for those. You're going to have your cabinet, the presidential cabinet. The president is going to be responsible for those. So when you think about this president is going to be dealing with courts, dealing with cabinet, dealing with prime minister, and under the right circumstance, this is going to be a very, very strong executive. It can potentially be a weak one, though. Couple of things. The cohabitation is a big piece. This idea of one party with the presidency, one party with the parliament and the prime minister, this can really rock a government. In this circumstance, if it is different parties, the president is going to basically focus that office's powers externally to the country in terms of foreign affairs. But what you'll see is that the prime minister is going to be basically focusing on the day-to-day running of the government. So that's really the differentiation that's basically going to be there. And in some of these hybrid systems, the president can not only fire the prime minister, but the president can also conceivably dissolve the parliament as well. So when you think about this job is going to have some functions of an American president. This job is going to have some functions of a prime minister in a parliamentary system. But what's different about this is that the executive is really going to have a hand running the parliament because the prime minister technically is beholden to the president. The other problem, though, is that if the parliament gets the other party's majority, the prime minister is now going to have a little bit of a hand in the president's business, which again will make this potentially a weak executive. This is the hybrid system. And what you see is that if the French are known for the man on the horse, so to speak, the idea of the president being one leader that is on top of above the fray, you might say, on top of the horse making the directions, this can be a very, very strong leader. Russia has got this. And Putin was kind of interesting because he was elected president a number of years back. But he had term limits. So what did he do? Putin handpicked a successor, and then he became the prime minister. So when you think about it, he wasn't violating any term limits by jumping from president to prime minister. And then when the president's term ended, he now, just recently in the last year, got elected to be president again. So you can actually game this kind of a system a little bit. But this is the only one where the voters vote directly for the executive that we've talked about in this chapter. I'll give you another video in just a few minutes.